The wind howled through the empty streets of New York, carrying the unforgiving bite of winter. David Carter, a man who had once had everything, now walked home from another long shift, his worn-out boots crunching against the icy pavement. His thoughts were heavy, filled with bills he couldn't pay and a future he wasn't sure he could fix. Then he saw him, a small figure curled up against the side of a building, trembling violently from the cold. Just a child, barely 8 or 9 years old, wrapped in nothing but a thin, ragged hoodie. David hesitated for only a second. Then, without thinking, he did something that would change his life forever. But at that moment, he had no idea. He didn't know that this one simple act, giving away his only coat to a freezing child, would set off a chain of events that would lead him to an unexpected opportunity, a second chance at life, and maybe even a chance at love. Because sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, kindness has a way of coming back to us. If you believe in second chances, in the power of kindness, and in stories that warm the heart, then stay with me, because this one will stay with you long after you've heard it. Before we dive into the full story, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more inspiring stories just like this one. Now sit back and let's begin. A struggling single dad gave his coat to a freezing child. The next day, he met a woman who changed his life. The wind howled through the narrow streets of New York City, carrying with it the unforgiving bite of winter. Snowflakes spiraled under the glow of flickering streetlights, blanketing the pavement in a cold, crystalline sheen. David Carter pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his body as he walked home after another exhausting shift at the auto repair shop. His hands, rough and calloused, ached from the day's work, but he barely noticed. The weight of his thoughts was heavier than the cold. The city had once felt different to him, alive, hopeful. But that was before he lost his wife, before the bills stacked up, before he went from being a successful businessman to a man struggling to make ends meet for his 10-year-old daughter, Emma. His boots crunched over the ice-coated sidewalk as he turned onto a quieter street. The neon glow of a 24-hour diner flickered at the corner, and for a fleeting moment he considered stepping inside for a cup of coffee. But his wallet, nearly empty, reminded him that every dollar mattered. Then he saw him, a small figure, curled up against the side of a closed storefront, barely visible under a pile of damp cardboard. A boy, no older than 7 or 8, huddled in the shadows, his thin arms wrapped around his knees. His lips were a pale shade of blue, and his frail body trembled violently from the cold. David slowed his steps, his heart tightening. He had seen plenty of homeless people before. This was New York, after all. But there was something about this boy that made him stop. Maybe it was the way his hollow eyes flickered open at the sound of approaching footsteps. Maybe it was because for a split second he saw Emma in that child's face. "Hey, kid." David crouched down, his voice gentle but firm. "You okay?" The boy flinched, his fingers tightening around the tattered blanket draped over his shoulders. He didn't respond, but his eyes darted between David's face and the street beyond, as if weighing whether to run. David exhaled, glancing up at the darkened windows of the storefront. No one was coming for this boy. No one was watching. Without another thought, David unzipped his coat and shrugged it off, the bitter wind immediately cutting through his sweater. He draped the coat over the boy's shoulders, ensuring it covered as much of his small frame as possible. "This will help," he murmured, adjusting the collar around the boy's neck. "It's not much, but it's warm." The boy blinked, his lips parting slightly as if to say something, but no words came. Instead, he pulled the coat tighter, burying his face in its worn fabric. David hesitated. He wanted to do more. He wanted to scoop the kid up, take him somewhere safe, give him a hot meal, but he knew how these things worked. The system was flawed. If he called the authorities, the boy might end up in foster care. Or worse, back on the streets within a week. "Do you have a name?" he asked. Silence. The boy's eyes flicked to the alleyway nearby. Then, without warning, he bolted, disappearing into the shadows before David could stop him. David remained crouched for a moment, staring at the space where the boy had been. The wind bit at his now coatless body, sending a violent shiver down his spine. What kind of world was this? A world where a child preferred the dangers of the streets over trusting a stranger. A world where good people lost everything while the cruel thrived. With a heavy sigh, David stood up and rubbed his arms to generate warmth. His coat, his only proper shield against the brutal winter, was gone. But strangely, he didn't regret it. He turned and continued walking home, the bitter air cutting deep into his bones. Little did he know, this single act of kindness was about to change his life forever. The scent of fresh coffee filled the small apartment as Emma sat at the kitchen table, swinging her legs beneath the chair. Her golden curls framed her face as she scribbled in her sketchbook, lost in concentration. David, now wearing his old, frayed jacket, the only one he had left, rubbed his hands together for warmth as he poured himself a cup of coffee. The apartment was cold. The heating barely worked, and their landlord hadn't bothered fixing it despite months of complaints. Emma looked up, eyes narrowing. "Dad, where's your coat?" David hesitated. "It got lost." Emma tilted her head. She was too smart for vague answers. "Did you give it to someone?" David exhaled, sitting across from her. He wasn't the type to brag about good deeds, but he also never lied to his daughter. "Yeah," he admitted. "There was a kid on the street. He was freezing." Emma's expression softened. She stared at him for a long moment before a small smile appeared. "Mum would have done the same thing," she said quietly. David's chest tightened. He reached across the table, brushing his fingers over her hand. "Yeah, she would have." Emma beamed, then turned her attention back to her. Drawing, David took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth spread through him. Despite the bitter cold outside, despite the weight of uncertainty pressing down on his shoulders, he felt lighter than he had in years. Then his phone buzzed. David glanced. At the screen, an unknown number. He frowned, but answered. "Hello?" A woman's voice, smooth, confident, and slightly curious, came through the line. "Is this David Carter?" His brow furrowed. "Who's asking?" A pause. Then, "My name is Rachel Miller. I think we need to meet." David sat up straighter, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He didn't recognize the name. He had no idea why a stranger would be calling him, but something about her tone, something in the way she said it felt important. The city bustled around David Carter as he made his way toward the downtown cafe, the cold biting into his skin through his old, worn-out jacket. Rachel Miller. The name had echoed in his mind ever since the unexpected phone call that morning. He didn't recognize it, didn't know why she wanted to meet him. Yet there was something in her voice, a quiet authority, a certainty, that had made it impossible to say no. The bell above the cafe door jingled as he stepped inside. The warmth was a welcome contrast to the brutal cold outside. The place was small, intimate, filled with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the murmur of early morning conversations. His eyes scanned the room. Then he saw her. She sat near the window, her posture poised yet effortless. Rachel Miller was striking, not in an obvious showy way, but in the kind of understated elegance that only confidence could bring. Her dark hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her tailored black coat spoke of someone who was used to being in control. But what caught David's attention the most was her eyes, sharp, intelligent, but carrying something else beneath the surface. something unreadable, as if sensing his gaze, she looked up. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, neither of them moved. Then she gestured toward the seat across from her. "David Carter?" she asked as he approached. "Yeah." He pulled out the chair and sat down, his instincts on high alert. "And you're Rachel Miller. You mind telling me why I'm here?" She studied him as if measuring her words. Then, instead of answering, she reached into her handbag and pulled out something small, a familiar-looking coat, folded neatly. David's. His breath hitched. It was his coat, the one he had given away last night, his hands clenched against the tabletop. "Where did you get that?" Rachel exhaled softly. "From a little boy." His chest tightened. He had hoped the boy was okay, but seeing the coat again made him realize just how much it had haunted him since last night. "Did he say anything?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Rachel shook her head. "Not much, just that someone gave it to him." David swallowed. "And?" She tilted her head slightly, her gaze assessing. "And I want to know why a man like you, who clearly doesn't have much himself, would give away the only coat he had on a freezing night." The question threw him off. It wasn't the kind of thing people usually asked. Most would have shrugged, maybe given a polite, "That was kind of you," and moved on. But there was something deeper in Rachel's tone, a curiosity, maybe even an unspoken challenge. David shrugged, leaning back slightly. "It was just a coat." Rachel arched an eyebrow. "Was it?" For a long moment neither of them spoke. The cafe's noise buzzed in the background, but to David it felt distant. "Why do you care?" he finally asked. Rachel stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. "Because kindness like that is rare, and because I think you might be the kind of person who deserves a second chance." The words hit something deep inside him, something he wasn't sure he wanted to acknowledge. A second chance at what? Rachel set her cup down and folded her hands together. At life, at the future, at something better than this. She gestured vaguely at him, at his worn-out jacket, his tired eyes, his hesitation to even believe. He deserved anything more. David hated how much her words affected him. "Listen, I don't know what you think you know about me, but I'm doing just fine." Rachel gave him a look, one that said she wasn't buying it. "You used to be David Carter, founder of Carter and Associates. You built a business from nothing. People used to know your name." David's jaw tightened. "And now they don't. That's how life works. That's how failure works," Rachel corrected. "Life gives us more than one shot. It's just a matter of whether we take it." David let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Is this some kind of charity case?" "For you?" Rachel's eyes flashed. "I don't do charity." Something in her tone made him believe her. She exhaled, leaning forward slightly. "I have an offer for you. A job." David blinked. "Excuse me?" "I run a law firm. We need someone with business expertise. Someone who understands numbers, negotiations, logistics. I think you could be that person." David let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "You want to hire a guy who changes tires for a living to work at a law firm?" Rachel didn't waver. "I want to hire a man who built a company from the ground up and who, despite everything, still has enough humanity left to give a freezing kid the coat off his back." Her words left him speechless. It was a tempting offer, more tempting than he wanted to admit. But fear crept in, the fear of believing in something again, of stepping into a world he had long since abandoned. "I don't think I'm the guy you're looking for," he finally said. Rachel studied him again, as if seeing past the layers of doubt, the walls he had carefully built around himself. Then she reached into her bag again and slid something across the table. "A business card. Take some time, think about it." David stared at the card but didn't pick it up. Rachel stood, slipping her coat over her shoulders. Before she walked away, she paused and looked back at him. "One last thing," she said. "That boy, he ran off before I could do anything for him, but your kindness reached him first. Maybe it's time to let someone return the favor." And with that she walked out. David sat there, staring at the business card. His fingers hovered over it, hesitating. The wind outside howled as another wave of snow began to fall. He thought of the boy, thought of Emma, thought of what Rachel had said. A second chance. His fingers finally closed around the card, and for the first time in a long time, David wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was right. David Carter sat at the small dining table in his apartment, Rachel Miller's business card resting between his fingers. The edges were crisp, the embossed letters bold against the smooth surface. Miller and Associates, managing partner, Rachel Miller. The words carried weight. They spoke of stability, of power, of a world he had once belonged to, but had long since left behind. He set the card down and rubbed his hands together, trying to shake off the gnawing uncertainty settling in his chest. Across from him, Emma sat with her legs tucked under her, scribbling in her sketchbook. She always started her mornings like this, drawing before school, lost in her own world of color and imagination. "Dad," she said, not looking up. "Are you going to take the job?" David blinked. He hadn't told her about it. "How did you—" Emma lifted one shoulder in a small shrug, still focused on her sketch. "You looked nervous when you got home yesterday, and when you look nervous, it's usually about work." She finally glanced up, tilting her head. "Was I right?" David sighed, leaning back in his chair. His daughter was too perceptive for her own good. "Maybe." She tapped her pencil against the paper. "Well, is it a good job?" He hesitated. "It's different. Better than fixing cars." That made him pause. Fixing cars was honest work, but it wasn't his passion. It wasn't what he had once dreamed of. Emma must have seen the indecision in his face, because she put her pencil down and folded her arms. "You used to do big things, Dad?" David's stomach twisted. He knew what she meant. Once, he had worn tailored suits and signed contracts that shaped businesses. Now he was struggling to keep their apartment warm through the winter. "Things change, kiddo," Emma frowned, "but not forever." David exhaled slowly. She was 10. What did she know about forever? And yet, her words stayed with him. David walked through the city streets, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. He hadn't made a decision yet, but his feet seemed to have a mind of their own. Before he knew it, he was standing outside Miller and Associates. The office was sleek. Glass. Doors, polished floors, the kind of place that smelled like money and ambition. It was nothing like the auto repair shop, nothing like the struggling coffee shops where he had picked up odd jobs. His pulse quickened. He could still walk away. But then the glass doors swung open, and Rachel Miller stepped out. She spotted him. Immediately, a knowing look crossing her face. "David Carter, damn it, didn't take you for someone who hesitates," she remarked, crossing her arms. David scoffed. "And I didn't take you for someone who gives jobs to strangers." Rachel smirked. "I don't, but you're not just anyone." She gestured toward the office. "Coming in, or are you going to freeze out here?" David swallowed the lump in his throat. Then, before he could change his mind, he stepped inside. The office was just as polished as it looked from the outside. Employees in business attire moved with purpose, the hum of productivity filling the air. David felt out of place, his worn-out jacket and calloused hands a stark contrast to the pristine desks and expensive suits. Rachel led him to a conference room, motioning for him to sit. "Let's get one thing straight," she said, settling across from him. "I'm not offering you a handout. I don't believe in those. I'm offering you an opportunity. Whether you take it or not, that's up to you." David narrowed his eyes. "And what exactly is this opportunity?" Rachel leaned forward, clasping her hands together. "A consulting position. You wouldn't be a lawyer, obviously, but my firm handles a lot of corporate cases. Businesses that need restructuring, contracts that need analysis. You know this world, David. You built a company from nothing. You understand numbers, strategy. That's what I need." David let out a short laugh. I haven't been in that world for years. So? Rachel raised an eyebrow. You think intelligence expires? David clenched his jaw. It wasn't about intelligence. It was about who he had become. Rachel studied him for a long moment before sighing. What are you afraid of? I'm not afraid. David shot back too quickly. Rachel gave him a look that said she didn't believe him. Then why are you hesitating? Because stepping back into this world meant admitting he had been wrong. It meant facing the man he used to be and realizing just how far he had fallen. I don't think I can do it anymore, he admitted, voice quieter now. Rachel didn't flinch. Then prove yourself wrong. The room was silent. David's mind raced. Could he? Could he really step back into this world? And if he didn't, what kind of example was he setting for Emma? Rachel slid a contract across the table. Take the night to think about it, but something tells me you already know the answer. David stared at the paper. The crisp black ink, the promise of something more. For the first time in years, possibility felt real again. David sat on the edge of his bed, contract in hand. The apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of city life beyond the window. Across the room, Emma slept soundly, curled under a blanket she had outgrown but refused to let go of. She looked so peaceful, so safe. He ran a hand down his face. Rachel was right. He did know the answer. He just had to be brave enough to say it. With a deep breath, David picked up his phone and dialed the number on the contract. It rang once, twice. Then Rachel's voice came through. Carter. A pause. Then, I'm in. A beat of silence. Then Rachel exhaled, as if she had expected nothing less. Good. See you Monday. The call ended. David set the phone down, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it. A second chance. Now all he had to do was not screw it up. Monday morning arrived with an icy chill, the kind that settled deep in the bones. David Carter stood in front of the Miller and Associates building, staring up at its towering glass facade. His reflection stared back at him, a man who had once belonged to this world, but now felt like a stranger in it. He took a breath, adjusting the borrowed dress shirt that felt too stiff, too foreign against his skin. His only tie, a relic from his past life, was slightly wrinkled, but it would have to do. All right, Carter, he muttered under his breath. Don't screw this up. With that, he pushed through the revolving doors and stepped inside. The lobby buzzed with efficiency. Sleek marble floors, hushed conversations, sharp-dressed professionals walking with purpose. The stark contrast to the grease-stained repair shop he had worked in just days ago was jarring. A receptionist with a polished smile looked up as he approached. Mr. Carter? He nodded, clearing his throat. Yeah. Ms. Miller is expecting you. Take the elevator to the 12th floor. The ride-up was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city below. As the doors opened, David stepped into a floor that felt even more intimidating. Rows of high-powered attorneys, glass-walled offices, the hum of important conversations, and then he saw Rachel Miller. She was already standing outside her office, arms crossed, watching him with that same sharp, unreadable gaze. "You're on time," she remarked. "Didn't think I had the luxury of being late," David replied. A hint of a smirk. "Good answer. Come in." Rachel's office was modern but lived in, clean lines, minimalist decor, but with stacks of case files spread neatly across the desk. A small framed photo sat beside her laptop. David caught a glimpse but didn't linger. Rachel gestured to a chair. "Let's get one thing straight before we start," she said, sitting across from him. "This is a job, not a favor. I'm not here to rescue you, and I don't expect you to act like you owe me anything." David met her gaze. "Good, because I wouldn't want to be a charity case." Rachel studied him for a beat, then nodded. "That's settled, then." She slid a folder across the desk. "Your first assignment." David opened it, his eyes scanning the dense financial reports inside. Numbers, contracts, profit margins, a language he hadn't spoken in years, but still understood instinctively. Rachel leaned back in her chair. "This is one of our clients, a tech startup that's bleeding money. They're on the verge of collapse, and the CEO is looking for a last-ditch restructuring plan." David flipped through the pages, his mind automatically analyzing the data. For a brief moment he forgot where he was, forgot his doubts. This was familiar. But then, just as quickly, the fear crept in. What if I screw this up? What if I don't belong here anymore? Rachel seemed to read his hesitation. "You know how to do this, Carter. You've done it before. The only difference now is that you don't have your name on the office door." David exhaled. She was right. He set the folder down and nodded. "All right, where do I start?" David spent the next few hours reacquainting himself with a world he had once ruled. He worked at a desk near Rachel's office, surrounded by fast-moving attorneys who barely spared him a glance. He wasn't one of them. Not yet. At first, it felt overwhelming. Corporate jargon, fast deadlines, complex legal contracts. But then, as he dived deeper into the numbers, something clicked. His old instincts kicked in. By midday, he had already outlined potential solutions for the struggling company, pinpointing where they were bleeding money and offering suggestions for a turnaround. Rachel walked by, peering over his shoulder. "That was fast," David shrugged. "It's not that complicated. They're overextending in areas that don't generate revenue. Cut those, streamline operations, reinvest in what works." Rachel smirked. "Welcome back to the game, Carter." For the first time in years, he felt useful. During his lunch break, David wandered to the break room, pouring himself a cup of coffee. The chatter of lawyers discussing cases hummed around him. And then, a voice from behind. "So, you're the charity case Miller brought in." David turned. A sharply dressed man in his late 40s stood there, arms crossed. His suit was expensive, his smirk condescending. "Excuse me?" David said, keeping his tone even. The man tilted his head. "Relax. It's nothing personal. Just that Miller doesn't usually take risks on outsiders, especially ones who fell from grace." David's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, another voice cut in. "Carter, ignore him. Evan enjoys the sound of his own voice." Rachel stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. The man, Evan Grant, smirked and raised his hands in surrender. "Just making conversation." Rachel ignored him and turned to David. "Don't waste your time proving anything to people like him. You're here because you deserve to be." David studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. Evan scoffed and walked away. Rachel waited until he was gone before turning back to David. "Listen, you're going to run into people like that. People who think you don't belong here. Let them think what they want, just do the work." David smirked. David wasn't planning on proving anything to him. "But thanks." Rachel nodded once, then turned to leave. But before she did, she added, "You're doing good work, Carter. Don't second-guess it." David watched her go, her words sinking in. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was building something again. Maybe, just maybe, this really was a new beginning. The office lights dimmed slightly as the day stretched into the evening, casting long shadows across the rows of desks. David Carter sat at his new workspace, rubbing his temples as he studied the financial reports in front of him. The initial thrill of being back in a professional setting had settled into a quiet reality. He was good at this, but he wasn't sure if he still belonged here. He had spent the last 3 days working tirelessly, analyzing data, restructuring numbers, and offering solutions that Rachel seemed to approve of. But there was still that nagging feeling, the fear that at any moment someone would pull the rug out from under him. The world of business was ruthless. He had learned that the hard way. A quiet knock at his desk pulled him from his thoughts. Still, "Here, Carter." David looked up to see Rachel Miller standing near his workspace, a coffee cup in hand. She wasn't in her usual intimidating stance. This time, she leaned casually against the desk, studying him with something resembling curiosity. "Yeah," he exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Figured I'd get a head start on the McAllister." "Okay," Rachel tilted her head. "You're ahead by 2 days. Overachieving already." David smirked, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Old habits die hard." Rachel took a sip of her coffee before setting it down. "Come on, let's get out of here," David frowned. "What?" "You need a break," Rachel said simply, "and I need food. There's a diner down the street that doesn't completely suck. My treat." David hesitated. He wasn't used to being around these kinds of people anymore, people who could afford expensive suits and talked about investments over drinks. But Rachel wasn't like that, was she? She was sharp, yes, calculated, but she had never looked down on him. With a sigh, he grabbed his coat. "All right, but I'm paying next time," Rachel smirked. "We'll see." The diner was a classic New York spot. Worn leather booths, the scent of grilled burgers hanging in the air, and a waitress who looked like she had seen everything life had to offer. Rachel ordered black coffee and a salad. David got a burger and fries, because if someone else was buying, he was going to make it count. For a while, neither of them spoke. It was strange. David had spent years avoiding conversations like this, keeping his distance from people who might pry too deep, but now, sitting across from Rachel, he found himself wondering about her story. "So," he started, stirring his coffee, "you said you don't do charity. What made you offer me a job?" Rachel leaned back, studying him. "Because I don't believe in wasted potential, and you, Carter, were wasting yours." David let out a small laugh. "You don't even know me." Rachel's gaze didn't waver. "I know enough." Silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken things. David took a sip of his coffee before setting it down. "All right, my turn." "What's your story?" Rachel raised an eyebrow. "My story?" "Yeah, why law? You don't strike me as someone who grew up dreaming of courtrooms and depositions." She tilted her head slightly as if considering whether to answer. "You ever hear the phrase, 'If you want justice, become the law'?" David nodded. Rachel exhaled. "I grew up in a place where the law didn't work for everyone, where the right people got away with the wrong things. I didn't want to be one of those people who just watched it happen." David studied her for a long moment. "So, you became the law?" Rachel smirked, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Something like that." For the first time, David saw it. The same guarded look he had carried for years. Whatever passed Rachel had, it had shaped her just as much as his had shaped him. "And you?" she asked, leaning forward. "What made you start your company?" David hesitated. It had been a long time since anyone had asked him that. "I wanted to build something that lasted." He stared at his coffee, watching the way the steam curled into the air. "Something real, something that gave people opportunities I never had growing up." Rachel's eyes softened slightly. "And what happened?" A bitter smile touched David's lips. "Life happened. I got too caught up in success, forgot what mattered, and then, before I knew it, it was all gone." Rachel didn't respond right away. She didn't offer empty words of sympathy, didn't try to fix him. Instead, she just sat there, letting the weight of his words settle. "Well," she finally said, "maybe it's time you build something again." David looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility. As they stepped out of the diner, the city had quieted into the hush of late evening. The streets were still bustling, but there was something calmer about this hour, as if the world was catching its breath. David pulled his coat tighter, exhaling into the cold air. "Thanks for dinner, even if it was just a bribe to get me to stop overworking." Rachel smirked. "You caught me." They walked in silence for a while. Then, out of nowhere, Rachel said, "You know, Emma reminds me of you." David blinked. "You've barely met her," Rachel shrugged. "Doesn't matter, she's smart, stubborn, sees things most people miss. That sound familiar?" David huffed a small laugh, shaking his head. "She's a lot better than I ever was." Rachel didn't argue. Instead, she simply said, "That kid sees something in you. Maybe it's time you start seeing it too." David didn't know how to respond to that, so instead he just walked beside her, the cold air swirling around them, a quiet understanding settling between them. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was walking alone. The crisp autumn air carried the faint scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor as David Carter walked through the park with his daughter Emma. The weekend had finally arrived, offering him a brief respite from the chaos of work. Though he had only been at Miller and Associates for a few weeks, it felt as though his life had shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated. But the biggest shift wasn't in his career. It was in himself. Emma skipped ahead on the cobblestone path, her golden curls bouncing with each step. "Dad, hurry up!" she called over her shoulder. David chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't have your energy, kiddo." She spun around, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "That's because you're old." David feigned a gasp. "Old? I'll have you know I'm in my prime." Emma giggled and took his hand, swinging it as they walked. "So, how's work?" she asked innocently. David hesitated. "It's good. A lot to get used to, but I think I'm getting the hang of it." Emma tilted her head. "And Rachel, do you like her?" David nearly choked. "What?" Emma grinned. "You talk about her a lot, and she helped you get a job, and she's really pretty." David sighed. "Emma," she giggled again, clearly, enjoying how uncomfortable he was. "You should bring her to dinner sometime." David shook his head, trying to suppress a smile. "You're too smart for your own good, you know that?" Emma beamed. "I know." As much as he wanted to brush off her words, the truth was that Rachel had been on his mind more than he cared to admit. Later that evening, as David was finishing up some work, his phone buzzed. Rachel Miller. His heart skipped a beat. He frowned at himself. Since when did a phone call make him nervous? "Carter," he answered, keeping his voice neutral. "You busy?" Rachel's voice was smooth, confident as always. "Not really, what's up?" "There's a gala tomorrow night, charity event. I need someone to come with me." David furrowed his brows. "And you thought of me?" "It's not a date, Carter. My usual. Plus one cancelled. And you're a part of the firm now, so consider it networking." David hesitated. He hadn't worn a tuxedo in years, let alone attended an event with New York's elite. "I'm not sure I'm the best fit for something like that." "I think you'll survive." There was something in her voice, a challenge, a hint of amusement. David sighed. "Fine, but if I embarrass myself, it's on you." Rachel chuckled. "Noted. I'll send you the details." As the call ended, David stared at his phone, exhaling. What the hell had he just agreed to? The venue was nothing short of breathtaking, a grand ballroom with high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and a string quartet playing softly in the background. David felt completely out of place. Dressed in a rented tuxedo, he adjusted his cufflinks nervously, scanning the room. The last time he had been in a setting like this, he had been a very different man, one who thrived in these circles. But now he felt like an outsider. Then he saw her. Rachel Miller stood at the top of the staircase, dressed in a sleek, midnight blue gown that shimmered under the light. She carried herself with effortless grace, exuding a confidence that seemed second nature. For a brief moment, David forgot how to breathe. She descended the stairs with ease, her eyes locking onto his as she approached. "You clean up well, Carter." David smirked, trying to ignore the way his pulse quickened. "Not bad for a guy." "Who changes tires for a living, huh?" Rachel rolled her eyes but smirked. "Shall we?" He offered his arm, and to his surprise she took it. As the evening progressed, David found himself relaxing. The conversations, once intimidating, became easier. He was no longer the man who had lost everything. He was someone rebuilding. Rachel watched him with quiet amusement. "See? Told you you'd survive." David took a sip of champagne. "Barely," Rachel smirked. "Come on, let's dance." David blinked. "You're joking." "I don't joke about dancing, Carter." Before he could protest, she took his hand and led him to the dance floor. The music slowed into a soft, melodic tune. Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder, waiting. "You do remember how to do this, right?" David hesitated before placing a hand on her waist. "It's been a while." Rachel arched an eyebrow. "Well then, let's see if you're as quick a learner as you claim to be." He chuckled, taking a deep breath as they began to move. To his surprise, it felt natural. "You're not bad, Carter," Rachel admitted, her voice softer now. David smirked. "Coming from you, that's almost a compliment." Rachel shook her head, but there was warmth in her gaze. "You know, I don't bring just anyone to these things." David's smirk faltered slightly. "Why me, then?" Rachel hesitated. "Because you needed to remember who you are, and maybe I needed a reminder too." The words settled deep inside him. They danced in silence, neither pulling away. As the night came to a close, Rachel and David stood outside the ballroom, the cold air crisp against their skin. David exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, I'll admit it. That wasn't terrible," Rachel smirked. "High praise." He studied her for a moment. "Thank you. For this. For—" Rachel stopped him with a look. "No need to say it, Carter. Just don't forget what tonight felt." "Like?" David nodded. For a moment it felt like something might happen, something unspoken hanging between them. But Rachel simply gave him a small smile before turning toward her car. "Good night, David." And just like that, she was gone. David stood there for a long time, the warmth of her touch still lingering on his skin. Maybe this wasn't just a second chance at his career. Maybe it was a second chance at something else too. The city was cloaked in the muted grey of an early winter morning, the streets dusted with a thin layer of frost. David Carter sat at his desk in Miller and Associates, staring at the spreadsheet on his screen. His mind should have been focused on the McAllister restructuring plan, but instead it kept drifting back to Rachel, the gala, the dance, the way her hand had fit so naturally in his. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. This was dangerous territory. Rachel Miller wasn't the type of woman who played games. She was composed, driven, someone who saw things for what they were. And yet, for the first time, David wasn't sure where he stood with her. A knock at his desk broke his thoughts. Carter. He looked up to see Evan Grant, the smug senior partner who had already made it clear he thought David didn't belong. Evan adjusted the cuff of his designer suit and smirked. "You've got a meeting with Rachel in 10 minutes. Better not screw it up." David clenched his jaw. "Thanks for the concern, Evan." "Oh, it's not concern," Evan chuckled, leaning in. "Just curiosity. Watching you try to prove you're still relevant. It's entertaining." David held back the urge to fire something back. Instead, he took a breath and forced himself to stay calm. Rachel had given him this job because she saw something in him. If he let people like Evan get in his head, he'd be playing right into their hands. Without another word, David grabbed his notes and headed toward Rachel's office. Rachel's office was bathed in soft morning light when David stepped inside. She stood near the window, arms crossed, her sharp gaze scanning the city below. "Carter." "Sit." David smirked, settling into the chair across from her. "You always this bossy first thing in the morning?" Rachel glanced at him, her lips curving. "Slightly. Only when necessary." She slid a file across the desk. "I have a proposal for you." David opened the folder, his eyes immediately catching the bold-lettered name at the top. Dawson Industries. His stomach tightened. He knew this company. Rachel leaned forward. They're in trouble. They need a full-scale restructuring to avoid bankruptcy, and they want us to handle it. David kept his expression neutral, but his mind was already racing. Dawson Industries had been one of his biggest competitors back in the day. He had pitched against them, won deals over them, lost deals to them. And more importantly, their CEO, Mark Dawson, was the man who had bought out Carter and Associates after David's fall. "You okay?" Rachel asked, watching him carefully. David took a slow breath. "Yeah, just surprised." Rachel narrowed her eyes slightly, like she didn't quite believe him. "You don't have to take this case if it's a conflict of interest." "I can assign someone else." David closed the file. "No." Rachel arched a brow. "No." David met her gaze. "I want to do it." A flicker of something crossed her face. Approval, maybe even respect. "All right then." She slid him another document. "You're leading this one, Carter. Show me what you've got." David exhaled. This was more than just another job. This was personal, and he wasn't going to run from it. Later that night, David sat in his apartment staring at the file in front of him. Emma had already gone to bed, but he couldn't shake the weight settling in his chest. Taking this case meant facing the ghosts of his past. It meant sitting across from Mark Dawson, the man who had picked up the pieces of David's shattered business and turned them into his own empire. Could he really do this? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Frowning, he stood and opened it, only to find Rachel standing there, coat wrapped tightly around her. David blinked. "Rachel?" "You didn't answer my call." David checked his phone. "Missed call." He sighed, stepping aside. "Come in." Rachel glanced around his modest apartment before crossing her arms. "I had a feeling you'd be overthinking this." David chuckled dryly. "You know me so well already?" Rachel shrugged. "You have that look on your face, the same one you had when I first offered you this job." David ran a hand over his face. "It's just Dawson. He's the guy who bought my company after I lost it all." Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she simply asked, "Does that change your ability to do the job?" David looked at her. "No." Rachel nodded. "Then do the job, Carter. Show them you're not the man they remember. You're better." Her words sank deep, settling in a place David hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge in a long time. Maybe she was right. The next morning, David walked into the Dawson Industries headquarters, straightening his tie as he entered the boardroom. And there he was, Mark Dawson. The man barely looked different. Same confident smirk, same expensive suit. "Carter," Mark said smoothly. "Didn't think I'd ever see you on this side of the table." David smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Life's full of surprises, Dawson." Mark chuckled, gesturing to a seat. "Well, let's see if you're still as sharp as you used to be." David sat down, his confidence settling in. He wasn't here to relive the past. He was here to win. The conference room at Dawson Industries was cold, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. The walls were lined with modern, impersonal decor, the long table gleaming under the soft overhead lights. David Carter sat across from Mark Dawson, the man who had once been his greatest competitor and now his reluctant client. The air between them was thick with unspoken history. Mark leaned back in his chair, smirking. "I have to admit, Carter, when I heard you were handling this case, I thought it was some kind of joke." David smiled tightly, refusing to take the bait. And yet, here we are. Rachel sat beside him, her expression unreadable. She had barely spoken since the meeting started, letting David take the lead. This was his test, his moment to prove he wasn't just a washed-up businessman, but someone who still had the instincts and intelligence to play in this world. Mark exhaled dramatically, flipping through the report David had put together. "This is all well and good, but I need more than just pretty numbers. Why should I trust you to fix my company?" David kept his voice even. "Because I've been exactly where you are right now." The smirk on Mark's face faltered slightly. David leaned forward. "I know what it's like to think you have everything under control, to believe your company is too strong to fail. And then, before you know it, the cracks start to show. Profits drop, investors get nervous, and suddenly you're fighting to stay afloat." Mark's expression darkened, but he didn't interrupt. "The difference between you and me," David continued, "I didn't have anyone to pull me back from the edge. You do." Silence filled the room. Rachel glanced sideways at David, a flicker of approval in her eyes. Mark's fingers tapped against the table. "All right, Carter. Let's see if you're as good as you used to be. Fix this mess and maybe I'll start taking you seriously." David didn't flinch. "You don't have to take me seriously, Dawson. Just take the results seriously." Mark let out a dry chuckle. "We'll see." The meeting concluded, and as they left the building, Rachel finally broke her silence. "That was impressive." David exhaled, tension still coiled in his chest. "Was it?" Rachel smirked. "You turned the power dynamic on him. Instead of proving yourself, you made him realize he needed you. That's how you win negotiations." David looked at her. "Was that a compliment, Miller?" Rachel rolled her eyes. "Don't get used to it." That evening, David found himself at home, sitting at the kitchen table with Emma as she worked. "On a school project." She glanced up, noticing the way he stared into space. "Dad?" David blinked. "Yeah." Emma tilted her head. "You look different. Happier, maybe?" David huffed a small laugh. "That obvious?" Emma grinned. "I know you, Dad." David watched his daughter for a moment, a warmth spreading through him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was actually moving forward. Then his phone buzzed. Rachel Miller. "Meet me at the office. Now." David frowned, his pulse quickening. What now? The city was quiet by the time David reached Miller and Associates. Inside, the office was dimly lit, most employees long gone. Rachel was waiting in her office, arms crossed, an unreadable expression on her face. David shut the door behind him. "What's going on?" Rachel slid a file across the desk. "I found something." David picked it up and skimmed the contents. His stomach tightened. Dawson Industries had been cooking their books. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. Rachel nodded. "Positive. They've been hiding debts, shifting numbers to make their losses seem smaller than they are. This isn't just a failing company, Carter. It's fraud." David let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. "This changed everything. If we expose this, Dawson Industries will collapse overnight," Rachel continued. "But if we don't, we're complicit." David set the file down, his mind racing. He had spent years blaming Mark Dawson for taking his company, for thriving while David fell apart. And now Mark was the one about to lose everything. Rachel watched him carefully. "I need to know where you stand on this, David. Do we take them down, or do we walk away?" David didn't hesitate this time. "We do the right thing." Rachel nodded, as if she had expected that answer. "Good, because I've already scheduled a meeting with the SEC. David let out a low whistle. "You really don't waste time, do you?" Rachel smirked. "You're just figuring that out now." For a moment, they just stood there. Two people who had both fought to be where they were, who had both been broken, but refused to stay down. Then Rachel exhaled, the smirk fading into something softer. "You did good today, Carter." David met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "So did you." A beat of silence. Then Rachel broke it with her usual sarcasm. "Don't get cocky." David chuckled. Too late. As he walked out of the office, he felt it. Something shifting, something real. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was winning. The weight of Dawson Industries' fraudulent activities pressed down on David Carter as he sat in the dimly lit conference room of Miller and Associates. The air was thick with tension, the silence stretching between him and Rachel Miller, who sat across the table, fingers tapping rhythmically against the sleek wooden surface. The evidence was irrefutable. The numbers had been manipulated. Debt had been buried under layers of false reports. Mark Dawson had been lying to investors, to the board, to everyone. David exhaled, staring at the documents spread before him. This wasn't just business. This was a ticking time bomb. Rachel finally broke the silence. "We have a meeting with the SEC tomorrow morning." David looked up. "That's soon," Rachel nodded. "This isn't something we sit on, Carter. We have a legal and ethical responsibility to report it." David ran a hand down his face. No, it's just Dawson is going to come at us with everything he has." Rachel smirked, a glint of steel in her eyes. "Let him try." David chuckled, but it lacked humor. "You really love the fight, don't you?" Rachel leaned back in her chair. "It's not about the fight. It's about doing what's right." David held her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. That was the difference between them and people like Dawson. They weren't afraid to stand in the fire. Later that night, David's phone buzzed as he sat on his apartment's small balcony, the cold air biting at his skin. He glanced at the screen, Mark Dawson. David hesitated, then answered. "Dawson." There was a pause before Mark spoke. "Carter, we need to talk." David clenched his jaw. "Unless you're calling to confess, I'm not interested." Mark sighed. "Come on. Meet me. One-on-one. No lawyers, no board members. Just us." David considered it. Every instinct screamed that this was a bad idea, but something about Mark's tone. He sounded desperate. "Fine. Where?" An hour later, David walked into a private lounge in the Upper West Side, where Mark Dawson was already waiting. He looked composed, too composed, like a man who had already decided his next move. Mark gestured toward the seat across from him. "Glad you came." David sat, but didn't relax. "Let's skip the small talk, Dawson. What do you want?" Mark sighed, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "I know you found the numbers." David didn't respond. He didn't need to. Mark smirked. "I also know you and Miller are planning to go to the SEC first thing tomorrow morning." David's shoulders tensed. "And?" Mark leaned forward. "I want to make you an offer." David exhaled sharply, already disgusted. "Let me guess. Money? Power? A piece of your sinking ship in exchange for my silence?" Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "Not quite. I know you, Carter. You don't care about money the way most guys do. You care about Emma. About stability. About making sure you never end up where you were a few years ago." David's fingers curled into fists under the table. "I can make sure that never happens again," Mark continued. "I have connections. You stay out of this, and I'll make sure you land on your feet, permanently. You and Emma will never have to worry again." David's jaw tightened. "And if I don't?" Mark's smile faded. "Then I make sure you never work in this town again. I'll burn every bridge you've rebuilt, Carter. I'll turn the entire industry against you." David leaned forward, voice dangerously low. "You already took everything from me once. You think I'm afraid of starting over again?" Mark studied him, his smirk slowly returning. "I think you're afraid of losing again, and this time it's not just about you. It's about your daughter. Think about her, Carter." David's chest burned with anger. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "Go to hell, Dawson." Mark didn't flinch. "Enjoy the fight while it lasts, Carter. It won't end well for you." David turned on his heel and walked out, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. This wasn't just business anymore. This was war. David barely slept that night, his mind racing. He knew Mark Dawson was dangerous, but this was a new level of corruption. By the time he arrived at Miller and Associates the next morning, Rachel was already waiting in the conference room, the SEC representatives seated at the far end of the table. She arched a brow when she saw him. "Rough night?" David exhaled. "You have no idea." Rachel motioned for him to sit, then turned to the SEC officials. "Shall we begin?" One of the agents nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Please, what do you have for us?" Rachel slid the file across the table, and David felt a brief surge of relief. This was it. They were doing the right thing. Then the doors burst open. Mark Dawson walked in. David stiffened, but it was Rachel's reaction that caught him off guard. She didn't look surprised. She looked angry. Mark strode in confidently, handing a document to the SEC agents. "I'd like to formally report financial irregularities within my company." David's stomach dropped. Rachel's hands curled into fists. "You son of a—" Mark smirked. "What? You thought I wouldn't get ahead of this? It's all about controlling the narrative, Miller." He turned to the SEC agents. "I only recently discovered these discrepancies, and I want full cooperation with your investigation." David's blood ran cold. Dawson had flipped the script. By reporting it himself, he would minimize his own consequences, shifting the blame to his CFOs, maybe even claiming ignorance. Rachel's jaw was tight. "You knew we were coming for you." Mark shrugged. "I just made sure you weren't the ones who got the glory." David's hands curled into fists. "You think this lets you off the hook?" Mark smiled. "I think this buys me time. And in business, Carter, time is everything." Rachel shot a furious glance at the SEC agents. "You realize he's just trying to cover his own ass, right?" One of the agents sighed. "Ms. Miller, we'll conduct a full investigation. But since Mr. Dawson came forward voluntarily, it will affect how penalties are assigned." David could barely contain his rage. Mark had stolen his victory. As Dawson turned to leave, he clapped David on the shoulder. "Nice try, Carter. Better luck next time." David barely held himself back. Rachel exhaled, staring at the SEC agents in frustration. Then she turned to David, her voice cold. "We're not done yet?" David nodded, his jaw clenched. "No, they weren't." The tension in Miller and Associates' conference room hung heavy like a storm on the horizon. David Carter paced near the window, his fists clenching and unclenching as he replayed the disastrous meeting with the SEC in his mind. Mark Dawson had outmaneuvered them. Instead of being exposed as a fraud, he had spun the narrative in his favor, reporting his company's financial mismanagement himself and shifting the blame onto his executives. Now, instead of facing the full consequences, he was buying time, minimizing his punishment, and walking away looking like a responsible CEO. David could still hear Dawson's smug parting words ringing in his ears. "Nice try, Carter. Better luck next time." Rachel sat at the head of the table, her jaw set, eyes burning with quiet fury. She had barely spoken since Dawson had pulled his power move, and David knew that silence from her was more dangerous than shouting. Finally, she exhaled sharply and turned to face him. "We underestimated him," David scoffed. "No, we knew exactly who he was. We just didn't expect him to be one step ahead." Rachel's gaze sharpened. "We're not letting him get away with this." David leaned against the window, running a hand through his hair. "What can we do? He's already framed the story. Even if we go public, it'll look like we're just trying to cover our own loss." Rachel's fingers drummed against the table. "We find another way. There's always another way." David met her gaze, seeing the fire still burning behind her eyes. That was the thing about Rachel. She never gave up, and neither would he. That evening, David sat on the worn-out couch in his apartment, staring at a flickering candle Emma had set on the coffee table. His daughter sat cross-legged beside him, her sketchbook open in her lap. "You look mad," she said, not looking up. David sighed. "I'm just frustrated." Emma's pencil moved over the paper. "Is it about work?" David glanced at her. "Yeah." She didn't press, just kept Drawing. A few moments later, she turned her sketchbook toward him. It was a simple drawing, a tree standing tall in a storm, the wind trying to knock it down, but its roots holding firm. David swallowed. "What's this?" Emma smiled. "It's you, Dad." His chest tightened. "Trees don't move when the wind gets rough," she continued. "They just hold on until the storm passes." David stared at the sketch, something shifting inside him. His daughter, without even knowing the details, had given him exactly what he needed to hear. He reached over, ruffling her hair. "You're too smart for your own good, kid," she grinned. "I know." David exhaled. "All right, time for bed." As she ran off, he sat back, gripping the drawing in his hands. Maybe they had lost today, but the storm wasn't over yet. The next morning, David walked into Miller and Associates with a renewed sense of purpose. Rachel was already in her office, hunched over her desk, reviewing financial reports. She looked up when he entered. "Tell me you have something," she said. David dropped a file onto her desk. "Dawson played his hand, but he's not untouchable. He still has shareholders to answer to, and if we hit him where it hurts, his reputation, we can force a real investigation." Rachel flipped through the file, her eyes scanning rapidly. "And how do we do that?" David pulled up a media contact list on her laptop. "We go public. Not with accusations, because right now it would sound like sour grapes. We leak the facts." Rachel arched an eyebrow. "You're suggesting we fight dirty?" David shook his head. "No, I'm suggesting we fight smart. Dawson used the system against us. We use the truth against him. We don't have to accuse him of fraud outright. We just have to make sure enough eyes are on him that he can't wiggle out of this." Rachel smirked. "I like the way you think, Carter." By midday, they had quietly leaked key financial inconsistencies to a few well-respected business journalists. They made no direct claims, just provided the right breadcrumbs, information that would inevitably lead reporters to dig deeper. Within hours, the first article went live. Questions arise over Dawson Industries' financial reporting. Investors demand transparency. Then another, CEO Mark Dawson's proactive reporting, raises suspicions. Is he covering for something bigger? By the evening, the Dawson Industries board was in a full-blown panic. David sat back watching as the dominoes began to fall. Rachel leaned against his desk, arms crossed, smirking. "Not bad, Carter." David smirked back. "Told you. We just had to hit where it hurts." Her gaze softened slightly. "You're good at this, you know." David tilted his head. "At what?" "Fighting for something bigger than yourself." The words settled between them, deeper than she probably intended, and suddenly David realized something. This wasn't just about Dawson. It wasn't even about proving himself anymore. It was about building something that mattered. That night, as they left the office together, the city lights glowing around them, David glanced at Rachel. "You really never stop, do you?" he asked. Rachel smiled. "Neither do you." David hesitated, then finally said what had been on his mind for weeks. "You don't just do this because you love the fight. You do it because you believe in people." Rachel's smile faded slightly, but not in a bad way. "And you don't?" David exhaled. "I didn't. Not for a long time, but maybe I do now." They stood there in silence for a moment. The weight of everything hung between them. The battles, the setbacks, the victories. Rachel looked at him, something unreadable in her gaze. "Come to dinner with me," David said suddenly. Rachel blinked. "Is that a date, Carter?" David smirked. "Call it whatever you want." Rachel chuckled, shaking her head. "Fine, but you're paying." David laughed. "Deal." And for the first time in years, as he walked away, he didn't feel like a man trying to rebuild his past. He felt like a man finally stepping into his future. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the crisp December air, settling on the sidewalks of New York like delicate whispers of the past. The city was alive with holiday cheer. Twinkling lights adorned every storefront, carolers filled the streets. With music and the scent of cinnamon and roasted chestnuts lingered in the air. David Carter stood near the entrance of a bustling community center, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. A year ago, he wouldn't have imagined himself here, not just as a man who had found stability, but as someone who had truly rebuilt his life. Tonight wasn't about business deals or court cases. Tonight was about something bigger. The doors swung open, and Rachel Miller stepped outside, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. She spotted him immediately, a smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. "You're early," David chuckled. "Well, I figured if I was going to do this whole charity thing, I might as well do it right." Rachel arched an eyebrow. "This whole charity thing? Carter, you co-founded this event?" David shook his head with a smile. "I just helped get it started. You're the one who made it happen." Rachel rolled her eyes, but didn't argue. Instead, she stepped closer, nudging his arm lightly. "Come inside. It's freezing out here." David followed her into the warm, lively hall, where people bustled around tables filled with food, clothing, and holiday gifts for families in need. Volunteers wrapped presents, served hot meals, and welcomed people in from the cold. At the heart of it all, a small group of children gathered around a Christmas tree, their laughter echoing through the room. And in the middle of them, grinning. And from ear to ear was Emma. David's heart swelled at the sight of his daughter, passing out hot chocolate with an energy only a 10-year-old could muster. She spotted him and waved excitedly. "Dad, look." She pointed to a boy across the room, a familiar face, though now dressed warmly, with bright eyes full of life. The same boy David had given his coat to all those months ago. The boy caught David's gaze and hesitated before offering a small, grateful smile. "Hey, mister." David walked over, kneeling down so they were eye level. "You look good, kid." The boy nodded. "Rachel helped me find a home." David glanced at Rachel, who simply shrugged. "We had some connections. He's in a good place now." David looked back at the boy. "You staying out of trouble?" The kid grinned. "Trying." David ruffled his hair. "Good. Keep it that way." As the boy ran off to join Emma, Rachel crossed her arms and gave David a knowing look. "You're tearing up, Carter," David scoffed. "It's the damn holiday decorations. Too much glitter in the air." Rachel chuckled. "Right, of course." They stood there for a moment watching the scene unfold, the warmth of the room, the laughter of children, the quiet comfort of knowing they had made a difference. Then Rachel turned to him, her voice softer now. "You know, a year ago you were just trying to survive. Now you're actually living again." David swallowed, glancing down at his hands before meeting her gaze. "You gave me that chance." Rachel shook her head. "No, David. You took it." The words settled deep in his chest, anchoring him to the reality he had worked so hard to create. Later that night, after the event had wrapped up, David and Rachel walked side by side through the quiet, snow-covered streets. The city felt different somehow, not as cold, not as lonely. David glanced at her, then, on impulse, reached out and took her hand. Rachel didn't pull away. Instead, she simply squeezed his fingers lightly, a small smile playing at her lips. "You sure about this?" David exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, I am." Rachel studied him for a long moment before finally saying, "Good." And then she did something David hadn't quite expected. She leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't rushed or dramatic. It was quiet, certain, and filled with everything they had built between them. When she pulled back, she smirked. "Took you long enough?" David laughed, shaking his head. "You really don't let me have my moment, do you?" Rachel chuckled. "Nope." They kept walking, hand in hand, toward whatever came next. The next winter, the community center was fuller than ever. The annual event had grown into something bigger, a foundation dedicated to helping homeless children and families get back on their feet. At the center of it all stood David and Rachel, no longer just colleagues, no longer just partners in business. David smiled as he watched Emma run up to him, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Dad, look at the tree," she exclaimed, pointing to a beautifully decorated Christmas tree in the center of the room. At the very top, instead of a star, sat a single, small coat ornament. David stared at it, his throat tightening. Rachel leaned in. A reminder of where it all started. David exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, and how far we've come." Emma grabbed his hand, tugging him forward. "Come on, Dad, we have presents to hand out." David laughed. All right, I'm coming." As he and Rachel walked into the heart of the celebration, he realized something. He had spent years believing he had lost everything, that his best days were behind him, that he had failed. But in reality, life had simply been waiting to give him a second chance, and this time he wasn't going to waste it. Wow, what a journey! From a simple act of kindness on a freezing night to a second chance that changed everything. David's story is a reminder that sometimes life gives us opportunities in the most unexpected ways. But now, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love seeing how far our community reaches. And tell me, have you ever experienced a moment where kindness led to something greater than you expected? Let's share our stories together. And if you enjoyed this story, if it moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring story like this one. Your support means the world, and it helps keep stories like these alive. Thank you so much for watching, for being part of this journey, and for believing in the power of second chances. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and I'll see you in the next story.